In the autumn of 1944, German officers across Western Europe were filing reports that should have meant victory. American units had been shattered, convoys burned on narrow French roads. Tank columns were ambushed, surrounded, wiped out. Entire battalions vanished into forests and hedgerows under German fire. On paper, it looked familiar. This was how wars were won. For 4 years, the German army had mastered the art of destroying enemy forces faster than they could recover. Poland, France, the Soviet Union in 1941. Break the front, encircle the enemy, destroy him in detail. Once his units were gone, the war ended naturally. But in 1944, something was wrong. The Americans did not stay broken. A regiment smashed near Aachen reappeared days later, refilled, rearmed, advancing again. A tank battalion destroyed outside Saint-Lô was reported back in action the following week. Divisions that should have required months to rebuild returned to the line as if nothing had happened. German commanders began to notice a disturbing pattern. Every American defeat was temporary. Every German victory dissolved into irrelevance. The front moved westward no matter how many American units were destroyed. In October, a German corps commander wrote bitterly that American forces do not fight like an army that can be defeated. They retreated without panic. They regrouped without hesitation. And when they returned, they came back heavier, louder, and stronger than before. To the German mind, this made no sense. Wars were decided by battles. Battles were decided by casualties, and casualties once inflicted could not simply be undone. Yet the Americans appeared to undo them routinely. For every destroyed truck, 2 more arrived. For every burned-out tank, a replacement rolled forward. For every dead infantryman, another took his place carrying the same rifle, wearing the same uniform, advancing under the same orders. German intelligence searched for explanations. Better training, perhaps. Superior morale. Reckless disregard for losses. None of it fully explained what they were seeing. Because the truth was not on the battlefield. It was not in the hedgerows of Normandy or the ruins of Aachen. It was not in tactics, courage, or even numbers. The real battle was happening hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines, in ports, rail yards, depots, and roads that never appeared on German maps as objectives. Germany was fighting an army. America was fighting with a system that did not depend on winning individual battles, a system that absorbed losses as a routine cost of operation. A system that replaced men, machines, fuel, ammunition, and food faster than the enemy could destroy them. By the time German commanders realized this, it was already too late. They were not fighting to defeat American forces anymore. They were fighting to slow an industrial process that could not be stopped by bullets or artillery. This was the battle Germany could never win, and it was never fought at the front. German commanders did not underestimate American logistics. That is the myth told after the war. In reality, German planners believed they understood American supply limits better than the Americans themselves. For decades, German military science had been obsessed with logistics. Railway timetables, fuel consumption tables, vehicle wear rates, the mathematics of moving armies. They had learned these lessons the hard way. In 1918, Germany had collapsed not because its armies were destroyed, but because its supply system failed. In 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled not at the gates of Moscow, but at the end of usable rail lines. Fuel ran out, trucks broke down, horses died, ammunition failed to arrive. By 1944, German officers believed they had mastered this brutal reality. They knew exactly how far a mechanized army could advance before logistics strangled it. And according to every calculation they trusted, the Americans were already beyond that limit. From the Normandy beaches to the German border lay hundreds of miles of ruined infrastructure. Bridges destroyed, railways sabotaged, roads cratered by bombing. German reconnaissance reported American tank divisions advancing faster than their supply depots could possibly follow. Fuel consumption exceeded theoretical maximums. Truck losses were unsustainable. Spare parts usage defied replacement schedules. From the German perspective, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Americans had advanced too far, too fast. They had repeated the same mistake Germany had made in Russia. And just like Germany in 1941, the Americans would soon stop. Not because of defeat, but because movement itself would become impossible. German staff officers produced detailed reports predicting the moment of collapse. An armored division required thousands of tons of supplies per day. A single tank battalion burned fuel faster than German entire corps allocations. Every mile forward multiplied the strain. No army in history had sustained such momentum, so the German response was logical. They did not need to destroy every American division. They only needed to wait, delay actions, local counterattacks, destroy bridges and road junctions, bleed the truck columns. Once the supply system broke, the American advance would freeze in place. Then, the counteroffensive could begin. But there was one assumption buried deep inside every German calculation: that American logistics worked like European logistics. It did not. What the German calculations missed was not a single innovation. It was an entire system. American logistics in Europe was not built around railways alone. It was built around redundancy, decentralization, and scale. Where German supply doctrine depended on fixed rail lines, centralized depots, and precise timetables, the Americans built something far more chaotic and far more resilient. They moved supply forward not in neat schedules but in floods. If a bridge was destroyed, traffic rerouted automatically. If a depot was hit, supplies were already moving to the next one. If a truck broke down, 3 more took its place. German planners assumed that trucks were a supplement to rail. For the Americans, trucks were the system. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army was operating the largest motor transport network in human history. More than 500,000 trucks were active in the European theater. They were driven day and night, rain, dust, snow, blackout conditions. It did not matter. Drivers slept in their cabs, engines ran until they failed, vehicles were abandoned on the roadside and replaced without paperwork. The most famous example was the Red Ball Express. German intelligence knew about it, but completely misunderstood it. They believed it was an emergency measure, a short-term improvisation, something unsustainable. They were wrong. The Red Ball Express was not a plan. It was proof of concept. American logistics did not rely on perfection. It relied on volume. Every American division in France was supported by a moving industrial base stretching back to ports, beaches, and factories an ocean away. Fuel flowed forward in pipelines laid faster than German engineers could destroy them. Ammunition arrived in quantities German officers considered wasteful. Food, spare parts, medical supplies, all arrived regardless of losses. The Americans accepted inefficiency because they could afford it. Germany could not, and this difference would decide the war long before the first American soldier crossed the Rhine. German officers understood armor. They understood artillery. They understood tactics. What they never fully understood was fuel. In every German operational plan, fuel was a limiting factor. In American planning, fuel was an assumption. If a German panzer division advanced too far, it stopped, not because it was defeated, but because its fuel trucks could not keep up. By 1944, Germany was already losing the fuel war. Allied bombing had crippled synthetic fuel plants. Romanian oil fields were under constant attack. Rail transport was collapsing under air interdiction. Panzer divisions that looked formidable on paper moved only when fuel was available, and often it wasn't. American forces operated under a completely different logic. They did not ask, "Can we afford to move?" They asked, "How much fuel do we need to keep moving?" The answer was always, "More." And America delivered it. Fuel arrived in Europe by the millions of tons, tankers unloaded continuously. Pipelines were laid directly from beaches inland. This system had a name: Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Fuel flowed from England to France through underwater pipelines faster than German aircraft could destroy them. By late 1944, American forces were consuming fuel at a rate German planners considered impossible. A single U.S. armored division used more fuel in one day than some German corps had available for an entire week. This changed everything. American commanders could maneuver freely. They could exploit breakthroughs immediately. They could encircle, bypass, and overrun German formations without pausing to refuel. German commanders could not. Entire German units were abandoned intact, tanks, artillery, vehicles, simply because they ran out of fuel. Engines silent, crews gone, weapons untouched. This was not defeat by firepower. It was defeat by logistics. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany made one final gamble. The plan assumed capturing American fuel depots would solve everything. It did not. The fuel was there, but German trucks could not reach it. American air power destroyed columns faster than they could advance. Captured fuel dumps were lost before they could be exploited. The Ardennes offensive collapsed not when German soldiers lost courage, but when German fuel tanks ran dry. From that moment on, the war in Europe was mathematically over. Germany could still fight, it could still kill, but it could no longer move. And in modern war, an army that cannot move is already defeated. To German intelligence, the Red Ball Express looked like desperation, a temporary improvisation, a logistical gamble that could not last. They saw endless columns of American trucks racing down French roads in assumed chaos. They were wrong. What looked like disorder was deliberate design. The Red Ball Express was created in August 1944, not because American logistics were failing, but because they were succeeding too quickly. The Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy was faster than anyone had planned for. Ports were still damaged. Rail lines were still wrecked. But American divisions were already 300 miles inland. So the U.S. Army did not slow down to wait for infrastructure. It bypassed it. Over 6,000 trucks were assigned to the Red Ball Express. They operated on closed one-way road networks reserved exclusively for supply traffic. Red signs marked priority routes. Military police enforced movement. Civilian traffic was pushed aside. These trucks delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. German intelligence focused on the trucks themselves. They missed what mattered. The Red Ball Express was not the system. It was one layer of a system. Behind it stood ports, pipelines, depots, repair units, replacement vehicles, and a production base untouched by war. When trucks wore out, they were replaced. When drivers collapsed, new ones arrived. When routes were bombed, alternate roads were already mapped. German logistics could not do this. A destroyed rail yard could paralyze an entire army group. A lost fuel train could halt a panzer division for days. American logistics absorbed losses without slowing. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express was scaled down, not because it failed, but because it was no longer needed. Ports were repaired, railways reopened, pipelines extended east, the emergency system disappeared, and the flow of supplies increased. This is where German assumptions collapsed completely. They believed American logistics were fragile. They were, in reality, adaptive. The Red Ball Express did not represent American limits. It demonstrated that America could invent an entirely new logistics system in weeks, and then discard it once it had done its job. Germany never faced an enemy like this before, and never would again. German commanders believed they understood logistics. They had studied rail warfare since the 19th century. They had built their entire military system around it. Destroy the rail hubs, cripple the depots, cut the lines. That doctrine worked against European armies. It did not work against America. From late summer 1944, German Air Force commanders and sabotage units were ordered to prioritize Allied supply lines. Bridges were bombed, rail yards were targeted, fuel dumps were attacked. Yet the American advance did not stop. This confused German planners. They expected bottlenecks. They expected paralysis. They expected the front to freeze. Instead, American divisions kept moving. The reason was simple and catastrophic for Germany. There was no single American supply line to destroy. American logistics were distributed, not centralized. Where German supply depended on rail junctions and fixed depots, American supply flowed through thousands of interchangeable nodes. If one rail yard was destroyed, another took its place. If one bridge collapsed, engineers rebuilt it in days, sometimes hours. If a depot was bombed, supplies were rerouted automatically. German logistics were brittle. American logistics were elastic. By 1944, the U.S. Army had engineer units whose sole purpose was repair under fire. Bridges were prefabricated, rail sections were modular, road surfaces were rebuilt overnight. In September 1944, American engineers restored over 1,500 miles of rail line in France alone. Germany could destroy faster than it could repair. America could repair faster than Germany could destroy. This asymmetry was fatal. Even successful German attacks achieved only temporary disruption. A fuel dump destroyed on Monday was replaced by Thursday. A bombed rail yard slowed traffic for hours, not weeks. The German military had never faced an enemy whose logistics improved under attack. Every bombing raid forced Americans to decentralize further, adapt faster, and build redundancy. By autumn 1944, the German High Command realized the truth. They were not fighting Allied armies. They were fighting an industrial organism that healed itself. And no amount of tactical brilliance could kill it. For Germany, destruction was a weapon. Blow the bridge, crater the road, shatter the rail line. In every previous war, this worked. An advancing army slowed, supplies stalled, momentum died. Against the United States Army in 1944, destruction became meaningless because the Americans did not treat repair as a secondary task. They treated it as a combat operation. Every advancing army group was followed by engineer battalions whose sole mission was restoration under fire. They did not wait for the front to stabilize. They did not wait for security. They moved forward with the combat troops. Bridges were rebuilt while artillery still echoed nearby. The most important symbol of this system was the Bailey Bridge, prefabricated, modular, transportable by truck. A bridge destroyed in the morning could be replaced by nightfall. Some Bailey bridges were assembled in less than 6 hours under enemy observation. German planners could not comprehend this speed. Their own bridges required heavy machinery, fixed infrastructure, and time. American bridges required steel sections, manpower, and doctrine. The same principle applied to railways. German intelligence reported repeated destruction of French rail lines, only to see traffic resume days later. The reason was simple. American rail repair units carried entire rail segments with them. Rails were laid like puzzle pieces. Ballast was replaced with crushed rubble. Temporary fixes became permanent routes. By late 1944, Allied rail capacity in France exceeded pre-war levels, while Germany's was collapsing. Roads followed the same pattern. Craters were filled overnight. Steel matting was laid over mud. Entire road networks were rebuilt behind the front. German air reconnaissance showed destruction. American logistics reports showed recovery. This mismatch destroyed German operational planning. They would schedule counterattacks based on assumed supply delays. The delays never came. Every hour Germany bought with destruction was stolen back by repair. By winter 1944, German officers began using a new phrase in reports. Enemy repair capacity exceeds destructive effect. This was not a tactical failure, it was a systemic defeat. You cannot win a war against an enemy who repairs faster than you can destroy. By late 1944, Germany was no longer fighting to win the war. It was fighting to delay defeat. This distinction mattered. Earlier in the war, German logistics had supported movement, initiative, and operational flexibility. Now, logistics dictated immobility. Every German plan was written around scarcity. Fuel was rationed before battles even began. Ammunition allocations assumed retreat. Reserves existed only on paper. Commanders no longer asked how to exploit success. They asked how long they could hold. This was not caused by a single failure. It was systemic exhaustion. Rail networks were shattered. Bridges destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Depots hit repeatedly by Allied air power. Even when supplies existed, they could not be moved. Ammunition sat in the east while units in the west ran dry. Fuel was stockpiled but unreachable. Spare parts never arrived. German officers began planning operations they knew could not be sustained. Attacks were launched with no resupply plan. Defensive lines were held without replacements. Counterattacks assumed miracles. This created a new kind of warfare. One side planned based on production curves and delivery schedules. The other planned based on hope. The Ardennes offensive revealed this reality with brutal clarity. Germany's final major operation relied on capturing Allied supplies, not protecting its own. That alone was proof the war was already lost. When the offensive stalled, there was no second option, no fuel to regroup, no transport to redeploy, no reserves to recover momentum. German units did not retreat in good order. They dissolved. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht still existed as an institution. But as an operational force, it was finished. An army can survive defeat. It cannot survive logistical collapse. By 1944, the war in Europe was no longer about territory. It was about time. Germany needed time it did not have. America had time it could not run out of. Every German plan assumed delay would create opportunity. Every American plan assumed speed would create collapse. This difference defined the final year of the war. German commanders believed that if they could slow the Allies, even briefly, political fractures might appear. Perhaps Britain would tire. Perhaps American public support would weaken. Perhaps negotiations would become possible. None of these assumptions were grounded in reality. The United States was not fighting for survival. It was fighting on a schedule. American divisions were rotated, reinforced, and resupplied with industrial precision. Losses were absorbed, units were rebuilt, operations continued. Delays did not change outcomes, they only shifted dates. Germany, by contrast, was fighting against the calendar. Every week meant fewer trained replacements. Every month meant fewer operational vehicles. Every delay meant another factory destroyed. German commanders understood this, but could not escape it. They launched counteroffensives not because they could win, but because waiting guaranteed defeat. This made German strategy reactive by definition. Initiative belonged entirely to the Allies. American commanders planned offensives months in advance, knowing supply would arrive. German commanders planned defenses days ahead, hoping supplies might arrive. The imbalance was fatal. By early 1945, the Western Allies were not asking whether Germany could be defeated. They were deciding how fast. Crossing the Rhine was not a question of possibility. It was a question of scheduling. Germany no longer dictated events. It responded to them. The war had become asymmetrical in the most dangerous way. One side controlled tempo. The other merely endured it. Wars are not won by bravery alone. They are won by the side that decides when the fighting ends. By 1945, that side was no longer Germany. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was no longer a contest of tactics or courage. It was a matter of arithmetic. German soldiers still fought bravely. German officers still planned counterattacks. German factories still produced weapons when they could. But none of it mattered anymore. Every German decision was made under constraint. Every American decision was made with abundance. When a German division retreated, it did so because it lacked fuel. When an American division advanced, it did so because fuel was guaranteed. When German commanders planned an operation, they asked whether it was possible. When American commanders planned, they asked only how fast it could be executed. This was the war Germany could never win. Not because its soldiers lacked courage, not because its generals lacked intelligence, but because modern war is not decided by bravery alone. It is decided by trucks, railways, ports, pipelines, depots, schedules, spare parts, and replacement manpower. The American army did not just fight Germany. It outproduced it. It outmoved it. It outsupplied it. By 1945, the Western Front was no longer a battlefield. It was a conveyor belt. Men, fuel, ammunition, food, bridges, hospitals, and entire divisions flowed eastward with mechanical certainty. German resistance could slow this flow. It could never stop it. This is why the Rhine was crossed. This is why the Ruhr collapsed. This is why Germany fell in weeks, not years. The Red Ball Express was not a miracle. The Mulberry Harbors were not lucky improvisations. The fuel pipelines were not clever tricks. They were expressions of a system designed for one purpose: to turn industrial capacity into battlefield dominance. When the last German unit surrendered in May 1945, the outcome had already been decided months earlier. The final battles were not tests of strength. They were confirmations of inevitability. The battle Germany could never win was not fought with bullets and shells alone. It was fought with clipboards, schedules, engines, and supply tables, and it was over long before the last shot was fired.